You can always feel it when the temperature in a room drops. Not the air conditioning, but the kind of cold that comes from people deciding you don't belong. My name is Natalie Brooks, and I've spent most of my career in rooms where I was the only woman, the youngest voice, or the outsider with the different ideas. I thought I'd gotten used to it. I thought I'd learned how to play the game. But nothing prepares you for the moment when the people you trusted most decide to freeze you out. It started slowly, the way these things always do. A missed meeting invite here, a project reassigned there. At first, I told myself it was just a busy season, that everyone was stretched thin. But then the little things started to add up. My emails went unanswered. My suggestions in meetings were met with polite nods and then ignored. The projects I'd led for years were suddenly better suited for someone else. I watched as my responsibilities shrank, my influence faded, and my seat at the table got colder by the day. I'd been with the company for almost 8 years, rising from junior analyst to head of procurement. I knew the business inside out. Every contract, every supplier, every margin. I'd saved the company millions, negotiated deals no one else could touch, and built relationships that kept us running even when the market turned rough. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. The new leadership team, led by a CEO who never bothered to learn my name, had decided I was expendable. The final straw came on a Thursday morning. I walked into the weekly leadership meeting only to find my chair occupied by someone else. No one looked up. No one acknowledged me. I stood there for a moment, waiting for someone to say something, to make room, to remember that I was supposed to be there. But the conversation rolled on without me, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I'd been officially frozen out. I left the room, my face burning, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to remind them of everything I'd done for the company. But I knew how this game was played. If I made a scene, I'd be labeled difficult. If I stayed quiet, I'd disappear. Either way, they'd already made their decision. I spent the rest of the day in my office staring at the walls, replaying every conversation, every meeting, every moment when I should have seen this coming. I thought about quitting, about walking out and never looking back. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not just at them, but at myself. For letting them do this to me. For letting them win. That night, I called my best friend Maya. She listened as I vented, her voice calm and steady. You know what you're worth, Nat. Don't let them make you forget it. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that hard work and loyalty still counted for something. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I had a choice. I could let them freeze me out, or I could find a way back in on my own terms. The next morning, I arrived at the office before sunrise. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and started digging. If they wanted to push me out, I needed to understand why. I pulled up every contract, every supplier agreement, and every email chain from the past year. I looked for patterns, for changes, for anything that might explain the sudden shift. That's when I found it. A series of new contracts with a supplier I'd never heard of. The terms were terrible. Higher prices, longer lead times, and penalties for early termination. It didn't make sense. We'd always prided ourselves on our supply chain efficiency, on our ability to negotiate the best deals. Why would the company suddenly tie itself to a supplier that offered so little in return? I dug deeper, tracing the contracts back to their source. The new CEO had pushed them through, bypassing the usual approval process. The supplier, it turned out, was owned by a holding company with ties to one of the board members. It was a classic case of backroom deals and personal favors. Exactly the kind of thing I'd spent my career fighting against. I sat back, heart pounding, as the pieces fell into place. They weren't just freezing me out, they were setting me up. If the new supplier failed, the blame would fall on procurement. If I pushed back, I'd be labeled a troublemaker. Either way, I was being boxed in. But what they didn't know was that I still had contacts, people who trusted me, people who owed me favors, and people who knew how the real business worked. I started making calls, reaching out to old friends in the industry, asking questions and gathering intel. The more I learned, the clearer it became. The new supplier was shaky, over-leveraged, and already struggling to meet demand. If they went under, our entire operation would be at risk. I realized then that I had leverage, real leverage. I could expose the deal, go to the board, and make a scene. But I knew how that story ended. They'd circle their wagons, protect their own, and I'd be out the door by Monday. No. If I wanted to win, I needed to play a different game. I needed to think bigger. That's when the idea hit me. Crazy. Risky. But just possible enough to work. If they wanted to freeze me out by controlling the supply chain, what if I controlled the supplier? What if instead of fighting for a seat at their table, I bought the table itself? The idea wouldn't let me go. It followed me home, kept me awake, and by Saturday morning, it was all I could think about. I started mapping out what it would take to actually buy the supplier. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I didn't have millions sitting in a bank account, and I'd never run a company on my own. But I also knew the supplier was vulnerable. Their financials were shaky, their leadership inexperienced, and their biggest client, my company, was about to become their biggest liability. I spent the weekend researching everything I could about the supplier. I pulled up public records, scoured LinkedIn for connections, and even called a few old colleagues who'd worked with them in the past. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this was my shot. If I could pull this off, I wouldn't just save my own career, I'd turn the tables on everyone who'd tried to push me out. By Sunday night, I had a plan. I'd need investors, people who believed in me and in the value of a well-run supply chain. I made a list of contacts, former bosses, industry mentors, and even a few competitors who'd always respected my work. I drafted emails, set up meetings, and rehearsed my pitch until I could deliver it in my sleep. Monday morning, I walked into the office with a new sense of purpose. I kept my head down, played the part of the sidelined employee, and waited for my chance. At lunch, I slipped out to meet my first potential investor, a woman named Linda, who'd once run procurement at a Fortune 500 company. She listened as I laid out the situation, the backroom deals, the shaky supplier, and the risk to the company. Linda leaned back, her eyes sharp. "You're telling me you want to buy the supplier out from under your own company?" I nodded. If I control the supplier, I control the leverage. I can protect the business, expose the corruption, and prove that I'm more than just a name on a spreadsheet. She smiled. "It's bold, risky, but if anyone can pull it off, it's you." By the end of the week, I'd lined up 3 more meetings. Each one was a test of my resolve, my credibility, and my ability to sell a vision that was equal parts revenge and redemption. Some people said no, too risky, too complicated. But if you said yes, they saw what I saw, an opportunity to turn a broken system into a winning hand. Meanwhile, things at the office went from cold to Arctic. The leadership team barely acknowledged me. My projects were reassigned, and my access to key data was restricted. But I didn't care. Every slight, every snub just fueled my determination. I spent my days gathering intel, my nights building a business plan, and my weekends meeting with lawyers and accountants. The supplier, it turned out, was more desperate than I'd realized. They were behind on payments, losing clients, and their CEO was looking for a way out. I arranged a meeting, posing as a consultant interested in a partnership. We met at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. The CEO, a man named Greg, looked exhausted, his suit rumpled, his hands shaking as he sipped his coffee. He said, "I'll be honest, we're in trouble. If we lose your company's business, we're done." I leaned in. What if I could guarantee you stability? What if I could bring in new investors, streamline operations, and turn this place around? Greg looked at me, hope flickering in his eyes. "You'd do that?" I would, but I'd need control, majority ownership, and I'd need it fast. He hesitated, then nodded. "Let's talk numbers." The next week was a blur of negotiations, due diligence, and late-night phone calls. I brought in Linda and another investor, hammered out a deal, and by Friday, we had a signed letter of intent.
I was about to become the majority owner of the company's biggest supplier. I kept the news quiet, waiting for the right moment. I knew the leadership team would find out soon enough, but I wanted to be ready. I spent the weekend preparing, reviewing contracts, planning my next moves, and reminding myself that this was bigger than revenge. This was about proving once and for all that I belonged at the table. Monday morning arrived with a strange sense of calm. I walked into the office, head held high, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel invisible. I felt powerful. I had a secret, and it was only a matter of time before everyone else found out. The leadership team were gathered in the conference room, their laughter echoing down the hallway. I paused outside the door, listening for a moment, then kept walking. I had bigger things to focus on. My phone buzzed. A message from Greg, the Supplier's CEO. The deal is done. Paperwork filed. Welcome aboard, boss. I smiled, a surge of adrenaline running through me. It was real. I was now the majority owner of the company's biggest supplier. The very people who had tried to freeze me out were about to find themselves on the other side of the glass. I spent the morning meeting with my new team at the supplier's office. They were wary at first, unsure what to make of me, but I laid it all out. My vision for the company, my commitment to transparency, and my plan to turn things around. I listened to their concerns, asked for their ideas, and made it clear that I wasn't there to clean house. I was there to build something better. The energy shifted almost immediately. People started opening up, sharing insights, and pointing out inefficiencies that had been ignored for years. I saw the potential everywhere: untapped markets, smarter logistics, and new technology that could streamline operations. I made a list of quick wins, set up meetings with key clients, and started drafting a plan to stabilize the business. Back at my old company, the leadership team was still in the dark, but that wouldn't last long. The first sign came when procurement tried to renegotiate a contract, only to be told that all discussions would now go through me. The emails started flying, confused, then panicked, then angry. I ignored them, focusing instead on shoring up the supplier's finances and reassuring our other clients that the transition would be smooth. By midweek, the CEO of my old company called an emergency meeting. I was summoned to the boardroom, the same room where I'd been frozen out just weeks before. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with accusation and disbelief. The CEO, red-faced and flustered, glared at me from across the table. Natalie, what is the meaning of this? We're hearing rumors that you've taken over our main supplier. Is this true? I met his gaze, calm and steady. It's true. I'm now the majority owner, and I intend to run the business with integrity and efficiency, something this company used to value. The room erupted. Questions, accusations, threats. I let them vent, then laid out the facts. The supplier had been on the brink of collapse. The previous deals had put the entire operation at risk. I'd stepped in to save the business, protect the supply chain, and ensure that our company and its employees wouldn't be left scrambling if the supplier went under. The CFO, who had always respected my work, spoke up. She's right. We were exposed. If Natalie hadn't acted, we could have lost everything. The CEO tried to regain control, but the board was listening now. They asked for details, for numbers, for proof. I provided everything: contracts, financials, and a plan for the future. I made it clear that I wasn't there to gloat or seek revenge. I was there to protect the business and the people who depended on it. The meeting ended with more questions than answers, but the balance of power had shifted. I walked out of the boardroom with my head high, knowing that I'd done what needed to be done. I'd turned their attempt to freeze me out into an opportunity to lead. That night, I met Maya for dinner. She raised her glass, grinning. "You did it, Nat. You bought the table." I laughed, the tension finally breaking. I guess I did. And now it's my turn to decide who gets a seat.
The days that followed were a whirlwind. News of the takeover spread quickly, and suddenly, people who had ignored me for weeks were reaching out. Some with congratulations, others with thinly veiled panic. My inbox filled with requests for meetings, partnership proposals, and even a few apologies from colleagues who had once kept their distance. It was strange. almost surreal to see how quickly the narrative shifted when power changed hands. At the Supplier, I threw myself into the work. I met with every department, from logistics to customer service, listening to their frustrations and their hopes. I made it clear that I wasn't interested in blame. I was interested in solutions. We streamlined processes, renegotiated contracts, and invested in technology that would make us faster and more reliable. The team responded with energy and creativity, and within a month, we'd stabilized the business and even started to grow. But not everyone was happy. The leadership team at my old company was still reeling. They tried to push back, threatening to find a new supplier. But the reality was, we were the backbone of their operation, and replacing us would take months, maybe years. I used that leverage carefully, renegotiating our contract to ensure fair terms for both sides, but also to protect my new team from the kind of backroom deals that had nearly destroyed them. One afternoon, the CEO requested a private meeting. We sat across from each other in a glass-walled conference room, the city skyline stretching out behind him. He tried to play it cool, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Natalie, I'll be honest, we didn't see this coming. You've put us in a difficult position." I nodded, keeping my tone professional. "You put yourselves in this position when you decided to freeze me out and gamble with the company's future. I did what I had to protect the business and the people who depend on it." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "What do you want?" I leaned forward. "I want transparency. I want fair contracts. I want a seat at the table, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been pushed aside because they didn't fit the mold. And I want you to remember that loyalty goes both ways." He was silent for a long moment, then finally nodded. "You've made your point. Let's work together to move forward." It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. I left the meeting feeling lighter, as if a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally lifted. I knew there would still be challenges, resentment, resistance, maybe even sabotage. But I also knew I was ready for them. Back at the Supplier, I called an all-hands meeting. I stood in front of the team, looking out at the faces of people who had weathered uncertainty and fear, and I told them the truth. I told them about the takeover, about the risks we'd faced, and about the future we were building together. I promised them that this company would be different, that their voices would matter, that their work would be valued, and that we would succeed together or not at all. The applause that followed was genuine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the weeks turned into months, the results spoke for themselves. Our client list grew, our reputation improved, and the culture of fear and secrecy was replaced by one of trust and collaboration. I started mentoring young women in the industry, sharing my story and encouraging them to fight for their place at the table. I wanted them to know that being frozen out wasn't the end. It could be the beginning of something extraordinary. One evening, as I was leaving the office, Maya called. "You know, Nat, you didn't just buy the table, you built a new one." I smiled, watching the city lights flicker on. "Yeah, and this time, everyone's invited."
Spring arrived, and with it came a sense of renewal I hadn't felt in years. The company I now led was thriving, and the old wounds from my previous job were finally starting to heal. I found myself waking up excited for the day ahead, eager to see what new challenges and opportunities would come our way. The team was stronger than ever, united by a shared sense of purpose and pride in what we'd built together. I made it a point to keep my promise of transparency and inclusion. Every month, I hosted open forums where anyone could ask questions, share ideas, or voice concerns. We celebrated wins, big and small, and learned from our mistakes without fear of blame. The culture shift was palpable. People who had once kept their heads down now spoke up with confidence. New leaders emerged, and innovation flourished in ways I'd only dreamed of before. One of my proudest moments came when we landed a major contract with a national retailer, a deal that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The team celebrated late into the night, and as I watched them,
I realized that the real victory wasn't just in the numbers or the growth. It was in the way people looked at each other, with respect, with trust, with the knowledge that they belonged. Meanwhile, my old company was still struggling to adapt. The leadership team had changed, and some of the people who had tried to freeze me out were quietly let go. Others reached out to me, seeking advice or even opportunities to join my new venture. I welcomed those who were sincere, but I never forgot the lessons I'd learned. Loyalty, I realize, is earned every day, not demanded or assumed. I also found myself becoming a resource for others who had faced similar challenges. Women from across the industry reached out, sharing their own stories of being sidelined, underestimated, or pushed out. I listened, offered advice, and sometimes just reminded them that they weren't alone. I started speaking at conferences, writing articles, and mentoring young professionals who were determined to make their mark. One afternoon, I received an email from Linda, my first investor. She wrote, "You didn't just save a company, Natalie. You changed the game. You showed all of us what's possible when you refuse to let others define your worth." Her words stayed with me. I realized that my journey wasn't just about revenge or proving a point. It was about building something lasting, something that would outlive any one person or setback. It was about creating a place where people could do their best work, where they could grow, and where they could find their own seat at the table. As the anniversary of the takeover approached, I organized a celebration for the team. We gathered on the rooftop, the city spread out below us, laughter and music filling the air. I raised a glass and thanked everyone for believing in the vision, for taking risks, and for standing together when it mattered most. Looking out at the faces of my team, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I thought about the journey, the cold stares, the closed doors, and the nights spent wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. I thought about Maya, about Linda, about every person who had helped me along the way. And I thought about the future, about the challenges still to come and the opportunities waiting just beyond the horizon. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. When they try to freeze you out, don't shrink. Don't disappear. Find your leverage, trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to play a bigger game. Sometimes the best way to get a seat at the table is to build your own and invite others to join you. As the sun set over the city, I knew that I hadn't just survived, I'd thrived. And I was just getting started.